Library's Biodiversity Center. This is the second talk in this series, and it will be the last one for this year. We are very pleased that you could join us for this fascinating talk titled They All Drank, Understanding Singaporean History Through Resources, Tales and Texts by Dr. Barnard here. He will be elaborating on how water can influence our perspectives and approaches to Singaporean history. If you already don't know our speaker, well, here goes. He is a rather well-known historian of the environment and culture of Southeast Asia. Dr. Barnard is currently an associate professor in the Department of History at the university. And in his time, he has undertaken the study of Singapore's history from an environmental perspective. His books mainly focus on the environmental destruction that Singapore has gone through in the 19th century and explore the influence of nature on imperial governments' decisions and vice versa. If you're interested or you want to find out more about his research area, please look for his books. He has published various single-authored monographs, edited collections, and has over 25 book chapters under his names. So now I'll invite Dr. Barnard to share his thoughts on this very interesting topic. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, particularly for those of you who are here, because I am going to be imprisoned in this chair. I've been told to, just for the Zoom purposes and things like that, for those online, nothing against people online who are watching, but welcome to everyone. As part of this biodiversity heritage series or biodiversity talk series, a lot of the discussions are about plants and animals and in Singapore and various aspects of how they have influenced our society. And that's often what I write about. But when I was asked to come and give a talk here this time, I decided to move away from the plants and animals, if you will, the biodiversity, to talk about a different approach to Singaporean history. And when I talk about Singaporean history here, we're really going to be, what I'll be talking about mainly is early, in a sense, early colonial history from about 1819 up through the 1860s. Because I believe that provides the foundation, and then we can think about it as it has implications for how we understand it and approach matters today. And I often use this particular slide as a background on my PowerPoint slide. I just want to point it out before we move on, because this is my favorite map. This is technically a map of Singapore, which was created in February 1819. This was created by the original, even though it says 1864 in the bottom corner, that was part of the cataloging system at the British Archives. But this was from the other people in ships accompanying Raffles. This is the shoreline, the shoreline they drew. And just to point out, let's see if this works. As you can see right here, that says watering place. Okay, they were pointing out where you could obtain water. And this is very important within the idea of its influence on Singaporean history. But before we start, let's test our Bahasa skills. See if I can get this rolling here. If I can get the PowerPoint to work. Oh, here we go. Well, it's a little blocked at the top for those who can speak Malay, but this is a fairly accurate translation here in English in the middle of what you would have at the top. This is from the Hikayat Abdullah, which was written by Munshi Abdullah, a Tamil Malay teacher who was famous in Singapore, particularly early Singaporean history, for the Hikayat Abdullah, which is his autobiography, which was created under the auspices of missionaries, encouraged him to write it down and such. And what he's doing here is telling a tale, or he's describing events on the arrival of the British East India Company in Singapore in late January, early February 1819. Now, Abdullah was not a witness to these events, so he's writing down what he heard happened and such. But what you get the idea is they land along the Singapore River, they take their supplies off the ship, they set up tents, they set up the camp for the East India Company officials. And then the key point was at the one of the last thing they did was Colonel Farquhar ordered them to dig a well under a kalat tree, pohon kalat, kayu kalat, and then the water in this well was used by everyone for drinking. When we move forward to an account written some 60, 70 years later, this anecdote is reduced to the small one you see at the bottom. The tents and baggage were brought ashore, and half of the Malay sailors commenced to cut down the scrub on the plain, while the other half put up the tents. They took 2 hours. Then a well was dug below the kalat tree from which they all drank. Just a brief summary of that. The key point in much of this, however, is that in the two tales, in the one from Munshi Abdullah, he emphasizes Farquhar's role. Farquhar ordered him to do this. Farquhar did this. Farquhar did that. In the version from 80 years later, there is no emphasis on someone taking action, someone giving the actual orders. So it's assumed within the larger text that it was Raffles. This is part of the glorification of Raffles and the, kind of making him a hero type thing within Singapore historiography. And it links into many of the debates when we think about early Singapore, which tend to come down to Raffles versus Farquhar. I personally despise that because it really doesn't mean anything, because ultimately it's like two different white guys arguing over how they're going to control this imperial society, and enough of that. Okay. But I want to emphasize the actual content of the tale. They land, they set up tents, and they dig a well from which they can drink. And from that well, they all drank. Everyone drank. Rich, poor, elite, lower class. They all drank from below, or a well dug under a pohon kayu kalat. Now, this tale can tell us a lot about Singaporean history. Because if we emphasize the Farquhar Raffles aspect of it, that tells us a certain angle of how we're looking at our past here in Singapore. But if we then dig into the tale and into the stories behind it, we can ask different questions. And one of the questions is, well, what about water? Where did people get water in Singapore? And was this important? And what might that tell us about the larger society and how the environment influenced people? So what I want to do, particularly in this talk this afternoon, is talk about what I snarkily call a liquid foundation for Singapore. In other words, Singapore could not have been founded as an imperial port, as a British port, without drinking water. Drinking water was one of the, beyond geography, beyond being at the bottom of the Malacca Straits, or where you have to turn to go to China, or up through, through the Malacca Straits onward to India. It's important as a trade node. A port needed to be established somewhere along the straits. Why Singapore? My answer really is water. Okay, water is key to the development of the port of Singapore, because water is a necessity. We need it to develop. Every community in the world has been built around a river, a lake, a fresh body of water that can provide sustenance to the growing community. So if we take it from that angle, we can ask new questions and understand things about Singaporean history in new ways, hopefully, and think of our environment. So let's start and think about this. For example, was there fresh water here in Singapore, in Temasek, in pre-1819 Singapore? Actually, yes. And it was well known before 1819 that there was fresh water here. Okay. One of the reasons Singapore is important as an island and where it's located is we have to realize much of the Straits of Malacca, traditionally, not today, but traditionally was lined with mangrove swamps. Now, mangrove swamps, as important as they are to the ecology of the region, to fisheries, to a variety of other things, are not good for humans looking for fresh water. Okay, they make it very difficult for a ship to pull in and fill up, refill their casks, their barrels with water. Singapore, however, had not only fresh water, but easily accessed places to obtain fresh water before 1819. So, for example, in a French account from the early 17th century by Jacques de Coutre, he wrote that Singapore has very good fresh water. What more do you want? As more European ships began to ply the Straits of Malacca, go to China to trade, move between India and China, all the ships on board would contain a book called a navigator. This was basically a book that told you everything you needed to know to sail between, for example, India and China. It told you how deep the water was. I mean, these were hundreds of pages long, and it would just be like, okay, the water's going to get shallower here. Okay, don't worry. There'll be some sandbars to your left, or details about what to expect. One of the more famous books, and it was written in the late 18th century, was The Oriental Navigator by a man named Joseph Huddart, who went and literally mapped out how to get from India to China. They take the book back to England, they reprint it, and all the ships who want to ply the trade, the famous country traders and others, would have this book on board. In the book, Huddart specifically says, stop at Singapore. Because, and this is before 1819, because there's plenty of water and wood for cutting. And more specifically, you didn't even need to go to Singapore Island. He said you should go to Barn Island, which today we call Pulau Senang. And he has a long account of, we stopped there, we had these barrels, we put them on shore, we filled them up, we stayed a couple of days, we cut down some wood, you could replace the mast on your ship, or small repairs might be, you could do repairs while you were here. So the main point I want to establish is, even before the arrival of the East India Company, Singapore was known as a place where you could refill your water, you could refill your supplies on the journey through this, after you go through the Straits of Malacca and you're heading on to China. And so it was already known for this type of, it had that reputation, okay? Which brings us to, of course, oh my gosh, everything. Singapore, history begins in 1819. We have to start there. The British show up, thank God. Well, the British arrive. And usually the way it's almost depicted in our minds is Raffles almost shows up alone on a rowboat and steps offshore, and just like the statue and what have you. Not really. When he arrived, he came along with a flotilla of 7 other ships. And these other ships had other jobs. One of them was the aptly named Investigator. The Investigator literally went all around Singapore and checking out, okay, what can we find? They went over to Batam and, wrote reports and said, the water at Batam sucks. Don't go to Batam. There's too many reefs over there. It's not a good place for a port. But Daniel Ross was the captain of the Investigator, and he wrote a report. And what he said was, yes, Singapore looks good. This is, I think, where we need to have our settlement. And he actually wrote on the 7th of February, 1819, fresh water is to be had at several places in the vicinity of the town. And there are some small rivers along the coast to the eastward where the water appears red. Now, this map was drawn up by Ross and members of his crew, okay? It is this water that allowed the East India Company, or justified, you could say, the East India Company's establishment of a port here. Okay? So they set up a port. We have to remember the East India Company wants a port. Why do they want a port here? They want a port so they can move ships, have a convenient place for ships to stop between India and China. It's a port where they can get new supplies, they can repair their ship, and more importantly, in our case, get water. After going through that mangrove line, Straits of Malacca, and things that weren't good. So without water, the company, or you could say Raffles or Farquhar, however you want to argue this, would not have been able to develop a community in Singapore. Okay? So what happens next? We have to realize the East India Company was here for quote unquote conveniences of the port. They don't, frankly, give a damn about Singapore, the island itself, or the people here. It's about the movement of goods between India and China, okay? And so among the earliest tasks the East India Company had was establishing waterworks and providing a steady supply of water to supply ships, okay? By June 1819, Raffles ordered Farquhar to prioritize the construction of convenient watering places, for example. Now, what they eventually did, now this is an early map of Singapore. So of course, the one on the top is the larger map. And then I blew up the ones on the bottom just so you can see. They are indicating where these watering places were. The poorly drawn one in the bottom right-hand corner where it says reservoir was where the Stamford stream came out, which today, the open square is the Padang. So it came out at, what would that be now? Like, I think there's a big hotel there. Or what's the four columns from the World War II memorial is right there. But you also see, more importantly, the watering place at the base of Fort Canning Hill. That's the more important one for our tale. That is where today the former police building is, with the multicolored window shade. Is that mica or whatever ministry is there? I forget. But that's in that basic area there, kind of at the base of Fort Canning Hill. So water was taken from the other side of Fort Canning Hill, mainly the Stamford stream, sent via an aqueduct to that watering place on the Singapore River. Okay. And this was established in 1819, and throughout the 1820s, 1830s, that's where you went mainly to get water, was on that side of the Fort Canning Hill, or the most important place. This became so important by 1823, Crawford developed a new water course and reservoir, as I said, with 11.3 meter frontage along the river face, from which there are 3 spouts. In other words, realize this is not for you and me, we'll say the regular residents of Singapore. This is to supply ships. And what you would have is, okay, let's move on, a system called fetch and pay. Lighters transported water casks from the government aqueduct, or that reservoir at the base of Fort Canning Hill, to ships in the harbor. So your ship was out past the mouth of the Singapore River. You would then pay one of 5 companies, 5 individuals, who would take the barrels, the casks from your ship, go into the river up to the base of Fort Canning Hill, and from one of those 3 spouts, fill them up. There were set rates on how much this cost. It was all, of course, it's a company, it's a business, it's capitalism, it's all rationalized. And there was a set rate for supplying the water. And we have to realize this was the main task of the mercantile government. How the people live, they don't care. We're here to make sure goods and services are provided to our ships to move between India and China. We got to get that opium to China and that tea to England. Okay? We have to remember the time and the context. This is the 1820s. Okay, so this is how the system essentially worked. But it came under pressure, and it came under pressure from several things. We can highlight certain historical events, which I will do first, but then secondly, it came under pressure because ultimately there were too many of us, population grew, Singapore, and that became a problem. But let's start with historical events, because that always sounds sexier. The trade worked, it was fine, the reservoir developed, but it actually hit a breaking point at around 1840. And the opium fleet, yes, the fleet from England going to China to fight in the Opium War, created the problem. So many ships were in the opium fleet that when they arrived in Singapore, they, in a sense, sucked the wells dry. Okay, there were so many ships. The waiting time. There are reports in newspapers. This became letters back to London. You can find it in a number of different reports of people complaining that this water system in Singapore is messed up. We had, it sounds like a very uptight customer, like I'm not being served immediately. Yeah, you had to wait 24 hours for service. They weren't able to fulfill all the things. The wells were running dry. It overwhelmed the water supply of Singapore, the opium fleet. And what this did was, because it overwhelmed the opium fleet, which I won't get into in too much detail, they had to essentially create a bigger reservoir with more spouts. I think they went up to 5 spouts in a larger reservoir in case the British had to come through again and attack China, or need arose. But what this does in this little tale is explain how we might traditionally look at the issue, focusing on economics, politics, warfare, British issues. This was something to supply the British. This was something to supply their commerce and why they were here. The average Singaporean, whatever the definition of an average Singaporean was in 1840, doesn't matter. You are not, we don't care. That's not our job. That's not our problem. We're here to serve the company and its capitalistic needs. Need to emphasize that. But that's the problem. There actually is a developing port. We often get these tales of how great Singapore was. Oh, all these migrants moved to Singapore. Everybody was oh, it was wonderful. We were a magnet. Everyone left Malacca. Yeah, okay, that's true. There were jobs here. It's true. But our population went from 30,000 in 1836 to 97,000 in 1871. Now, I know this sounds comically small today. This is smaller than an HDB town, okay? Even in 1871. But this was where Singapore hit a breaking point. How much can the natural landscape supply humans and support a human population on this island? And between about 1836 and 1871, we went past that breaking point. Too many people moved here. And a lot of this is revolving around the attractions. I might sound snarky and make fun of the company, but there were attractions. It provided jobs. People were migrating here. There was commerce, there was business, there was prosperity, if you will, limited and of course distributed unfairly, but there was. And so the society is developing, but there are implications to this. So for example, they begin pushing beyond the port. Agriculture begins to push into into the rural areas beyond that very densely packed small port area. Agriculture develops, particularly initially nutmeg, but eventually Gambier and pepper. And within 3 or 4 decades, Singapore becomes completely deforested. It's hard for us to fully comprehend that. The entire island was cut down. Over 90% deforestation. What that means ecologically is the streams begin to dry up. You don't have the I can't say this correctly, the absorptive ability of the forest to work as a check when rain falls. It would all just flush out, if you will. The number of people as the population arose meant that the natural ways of obtaining water became more and more perilous. So for example, traditionally, the regular population in the 1820s and 1830s would have wells. They would literally have wells in their compounds or in their yards. But because of this deforestation, there was a decline in rainfall. And some of this we can link into larger El Nino things and other larger global cycles, but some of it's related to deforestation. Wells began to dry up, or if there were wells, that water in them was pretty nasty. Okay? There were a lot of reports of that. And so water became a problem for the resident population, the average, person living in Singapore, whether Chinese or Malay or whoever. And one of the ways we can see that, or one of the ways that appear, is also in another famous shire by the same man, Abdullah Munshi, called the Shire Kampung Glam Terbakar. which means the Shire of Kampong Glam burning down or on fire. And this is a poem that is exactly what it says. In other words, Kampong Glam caught on fire and burned to the ground in 1847. The reason it burned to the ground, though, was because the fire wells, they had wells dug for fire, because everything's built out of wood, and you could dip buckets in, and everyone in the gotong royong, everyone in the neighborhood helped put out the fire. But the problem when the fire broke out in Kampong Glam was the wells were empty. And so there is a water crisis in Singapore. Not only is there not enough to drink, there's not enough to put out a fire, and entire neighborhoods are burning down. So we have a mercantile government who deep down doesn't care. Okay, they're there to make money. We have a resident population that is growing, but having difficulty getting water. So what do? Well, as this mercantile government wants to avoid costs, what it does is it goes to the Asian community. By that, I mean the Singaporean resident community, and says to the leaders of that community, this is your problem. You need to pony up the funds to take care of this. Now, what happened in the mid-1850s is they went to, for example, the Al Junaid family. And the Al Junaid family sponsored the construction of public wells throughout Singapore in the 1850s. So this occurred under Said Omar, who died in 1852, but his son, Abu Bakr, took over the construction of these wells. Realize this is coming after, in the wake of Kampong Glam burning down. Okay, and the Al Junaid sponsored the construction of 4 public wells, one in Kampung Malacca, one in Selegi Road, one in Penghulu Kisang, and one in Teluk Air. Okay, now these were public wells in which you could go, anyone in the public could go, and you would, in a sense, send your kid to go and fill up a bucket for your family to use for the day type thing. Okay, these were public wells anyone could access, paid for by a rich merchant family, but an Asian family, because the government doesn't want to do this. The government also approaches the richest man in Singapore, Tan Kim Seng at the time, and says, dude, you need to take care of your community. We're not going to do it. And he gives them $13,000 to purchase pipes to convey water to the town from a reservoir or that may be constructed. Eventually, a few decades later, and thanks to Tan Kim Seng, they build a fountain, and there's a fountain you can see right there, a picture of it, which was dedicated in 1882. It was eventually moved because of car traffic, or they want to put up, literally they wanted to put up a parking garage. Now it's along the kind of the esplanade or the near the Padang. Although I don't know if they were renovating it for a long time. I don't know if it's done yet. Yeah, between the ACM and the Singapore Recreation Club, somewhere along there, if you're walking toward the Esplanade. So local merchant, in other words, the Asian elite, the local elites are asked, told, however you want to look at it, arm twisted, to help pay for water for the community. And what this does is, nowadays, of course, we glorify that, oh, there's the Tan Kim Seng fountain. We talk about these things as noble causes. This is being done because the government won't fulfill its role, is really what it's coming down to. But it was getting bad. So what about these wells, these public wells that were dug by the Al Junaids, the other wells? Well, the best ones were located in descriptions at the base of hills. They had to be at least 3 to 3.5 meters deep, and the water wasn't great. Remember, we're still under droughts. We're still in a deforested landscape. The population grows every year. It's not a real solution in the long run because we're getting too big, if you will. And eventually, the government opened those reservoirs that were supposedly for the ships at the base of Fort Canning Hill you could go there and collect water too from a separate tank, but it was essentially fed by the same pipes and such. And so you had water carts, so literally carts that would deliver water to different parts of town. You had water carriers who would, for a fee, would bring water to your house in the 19th century. And this was how you got water in Singapore. But in the long run, this is not a feasible solution. And as bad as I'm painting the East India Company, there were individuals within the East India Company who said, look, we have an obligation. We need to deliver. If we want this community to develop, we need to get water. Okay. So eventually they had to do this. The wells were too much. So they began to plan or plot out, how can we get water to the public? How can we do this? And so a lot of these early maps, and we can get these early maps on digital gems through the library here and other things. I'm supposed to link this back in the library, by the way, and things like that. A lot of these early maps were drawn for them to help scout out where they could find water supplies and develop these things. So they're looking for a solution. They're searching for a solution. And one of the first people to come up with a solution was John Thompson, famous for Thompson Road, I guess Thompson Plaza and other things. But he developed a plan to tap aquifers on Mount Faber and Pearl's Hill. Okay, and this was in 1852. So realize this is running alongside, for example, when the Alginate wells were being built or dug and such. After looking at Pearl's Hill and Mount Faber, he realized, wait, it's not gonna, we're not gonna be able to move the water from there, and it's not gonna work. So then he said, well, let's try Tanglin. In Tanglin, there are some streams. Maybe we can tap something up in Tanglin area. But all of these still had a number of problems in this initial report. For example, they all were dependent on rainfall. In other words, we would just gather the rainfall and make sure it went into a reservoir near like Mount Faber or near Pearl's Hill. Okay. In his plans, they would provide a massive 15.1 liters of water, or 4 gallons of water, for 28,000 residents. This sounds like a great idea. The problem was there were 60,000 people living in Singapore at the time. And also, just to test you guys, I would love to see you live on 15 liters of water in a day. Bathe, cook, and drink. Okay. In other words, this plan has limited capabilities. When Thompson left Singapore, there were, of course, other engineers who came in and took the job. One of the earlier ones after Thompson left was a guy named Jules Moniat. And what he said was, okay, let's not do it. Let's go to Bukatima Hill. Bukatima Hill will provide the water. We can tap aquifers there, and it'll provide the water we need. This is going to be great. He drew up plans. He sent the plans to India, and they just went, yeah, no, I don't think so. Once again, it came down to, in a sense, the East India Company and its remit, as we would say today here in Singapore. So there was this reluctance to pay for the construction of whatever infrastructure we needed to get that water from Bukatima to town, for example. There was that reluctance, and this idea of we need to place our emphasis on the Asian elite, people like the Alginates or Tan Kim Sing. And this is around the time when Tan Kim Sing gave the pipes, donated the money for the pipes. But there were also engineering disputes between Singapore and Calcutta. For example, the engineers in Calcutta said, whoa, wait, stop it. There's not enough of an incline from Bukatima Hill to town, to bring the water. It's not going to happen. You would have to need pumps and other things to get it to a greater height, bring it down. At this time, Moniat's replying, Collier, famous for, I guess, Collier Key, starts to pipe in too. And they say, well, okay, we'll look for some alternatives. And they identify Balestier Stream. Balestier Stream is going to be great. And then they take a boat up Balestier Stream, And what they find is, and this is in the area of what today would be Tan Tock Seng Hospital, what they find is the leper patients bathe in Balestier Stream on a daily basis. And then so they came back down the Balestier Stream and said, no, never mind. Let's find someplace else. So when they discovered that's where the lepers bathe, that ended that plan. The result of all of this, complaints over the engineering of the actual structures, where it was going to come from, everything, just catty reports between Calcutta and Singapore, questioning people's intelligence and other things. It delayed everything for over a decade. Nothing got done. Good government bureaucracy. Okay. Well, by the early 1860s, we had a new colonial engineer named J.O. Maine, who doesn't get any credit. And I think he does deserve some credit because he said, okay, none of these are going to work. Let's start from scratch. Let's find a place. And he walked up the Thompson Road and he found a small rivulet at the head of a canal. And it went in between a range of hills that formed a bit of an amphitheater. Oh, this sounds good. There was a man living in there named Jawal. And he said, hey, Jawal, does this stream go dry during the dry season? And Jawal said, I've lived here 12 years. It's never gone dry. Oh, this sounds good. Sounds good. Maine said, this is going to be easy. All we got to do is build a very small dam. We can create a huge reservoir. And that stream, that rivulet, will fill up the reservoir. And it will never run dry. And he estimated it would provide 1.5 million gallons a day. So that's about 6 million liters. That's a lot. That's more than we'll ever need in Singapore, right? Because the population is getting to about 70,000 people. So Maine and then ultimately McNair, who oversaw prison labor, get to work on this in 1865 and 1866. And this is a picture of the construction of McRitchie Reservoir. It was called the Impounding Reservoir, but this is what ultimately is McRitchie Reservoir today. And they built this reservoir, and this was the only kind of project that the East India Company actually paid for in Singapore, or the only large public project that they left behind. It was finished in 1866, so right before the East India Company went away, and it was able to supply enough water to support Singapore for decades. This thing will last forever. Of course it didn't, and we went on and built other things. But then we have another problem. Of course, there's never an end to the problems. And I won't get into this one too much because it involves more of the politics and bureaucracy, but they had all this water backed up at Thompson Road, at the end of Thompson Road. Don't forget, you have to get it to town. And what they found was, for example, the pipes that Tan Kim Seng bought or paid for were useless. They were actually square instead of circular. So the water wouldn't flow well. And because of their construction, the way they were, essentially, they were never used. It was a wasted donation that he has this fountain for. Never used, never employed. Wasted money. But they eventually got the pipes and they got it to town. This is great. Where they got it to was another little tank, a reservoir station, which is essentially where KK Hospital is. Okay, it was, as they describe it in the records, it's near the Kampung Karbau. Okay, so right above where the Indian area of town was, near the Kampung Karbau, was a tank or a reservoir. Now then the problem is, how do you get it to town? And of course, what the government wanted to do was just pipe it to the areas of town near KK Hospital. Now, just for a second, think about that. What are the areas of town near KK Hospital? Places like today, what is the Astana? What is the kind of up to the river where white people lived? They didn't want to spend the money to send it to the other side of the river. which is where the majority of the Asian population lived. And so there were huge debates, and they would often use Tan Kim Sing's name in these debates, saying, look, he wanted his community to get water. So that was where his name did come into play, and it was useful. But they had to justify getting that water, if you will, across the river into Chinatown, the Chinatown area today, or where SGH is today. So water. Let's stop for a second. Too many facts, too many stuff going on here. Let's take a step back here a second and think about this. What I've been talking about is a natural resource, water, and how we obtain it in the early history of Singapore. And because this talk is at the Central Library, and I've been told to emphasize texts and things we can use here and what have you, we have to think about what I have used. You know, I've used things such as a Shire and a Hikayat written by one of the more famous authors in early Singaporean history. There's a tremendous amount of colonial records. They're not the most exciting ones, and it probably would help if I had an engineering degree when I read them, but there are colonial records about the construction of the reservoir and the piping of water and issues related to that. A lot of the maps, which are available here at the Central Library at NUS, contain a tremendous amount of information about that. And also newspapers. The biggest transformation in Singaporean history in the last 15 years has been newspapers.sg, just because it helps easy Googling or whatever, searching for keywords and text and what have you. But what we really need to do is go back to these instead of relying on heritage markers. For example, one day I was going out to dinner with my wife, and we were walking along the Singapore River up near Robertson Quay, and there's a historical marker for Tan Kim Sing. And it talks about how the wonderful contribution he made to give water to Singapore and everything he gave, and how great that was. And of course, I get upset as a historian and get uptight. My wife is like, we're supposed to be going to dinner and having a good time. Please move away from the heritage marker and calm down. Let's go to dinner. But the point is, we need to move beyond the heritage marker, nice tales, if you will, and not to, Tan Kim Sing did give a contribution theoretically to help water. It didn't work out, and they did use his name to eventually get it to Chinatown, although it didn't. His contribution didn't really work that way. But we often have these places in Singapore that have a historical past, but they get lost by the renaming and the retelling of them. For example, McRitchie Reservoir isn't just named after a colonial engineer who had really, he maybe expanded it a little bit, but they were just slapping, basically around 1900, 1910, they were slapping every place in Singapore with British names of civil servants at the time. Everything from Clementi neighborhood to McRitchie Reservoir. And so McRitchie Reservoir, which was originally called the Impounding Reservoir, and we even have Upper and Lower Piers and others. But my point is, we need to go back and look at these texts. We have them in libraries, we have them in archives, but we also need to ask different questions. If we simply just take the original tale I mentioned of a white guy showed up and told them that, he gave them water, he dug a well, that doesn't really tell us much. And it fits into the historical narrative we already have. And I think deep down, a lot of us are unsatisfied with that historical narrative because it doesn't address the average lives of people in Singapore. And I know it's delusional for me to say, like me, but in other words, average residents of Singapore, not the decision makers and not the, in other words, how did the average person in Singapore get their water? What problems did they face? And how did that change over time? Because that can tell you a lot about migration to the area, the development of the port, the development of the society, but simply by asking different questions. So the material's there, and the material may have been used by historians to support, for example, a Raffles Farquhar narrative, but we need to ask different questions. And by asking questions using an environment, using just different approaches, I think that helps us create a richer Singaporean history that addresses a lot of what we think about the society, I guess would be a way of saying that. And so it deepens Singapore history and heritage, hopefully. Yeah, to each is their interpretation. So I'll wrap this all up with the idea of they all drank. This is a picture of if it's renovated or ever uncovered. And like I said, it's been 6 months or so since I went there. But last time I was there, it was behind boards and barriers and things like this. But this is what the Tan Kim Sing fountain looks like today, theoretically. We'll see when they unveil it. It'll be interesting to see if they have some kind of ceremony and how they play that out in the press and on Mothership or something. But as you can see there, that's the Singapore Recreation Club in the background. So it's right about there on the Esplanade. So when we think about history, we can think about they all drank. So everyone participates. Or we can think about prominent individuals like Raffles Farquhar, or even Al Junaid family and Tan Kim Sing. But no matter how we think about all that, it all involves Singaporean history. Okay, so I'll stop at that, and please ask questions. I always enjoy having questions asked, even online for those online, if you're there. And so I'll leave it at that, and we'll open the floor to you. So. You need to handle it.
No, I guess. Thank you, Dr. Barnard, for that very enlightening talk. We'll invite the floor for the Q&A. If anyone has any questions.
Sure, Suhail.
Hi, Prof. I have sorry.
Oh, sorry.
I have a question on well digging technology.
On what?
Well digging.
A well digging technology. You might be beyond my cognitive abilities here, but okay.
You describe the stories of on the landing of the British. Because they were native inhabitants, they were New Zealand inhabitants.
Sure, of course.
We had their own.
There were about 1,000 people here.
Yeah. And I was wondering if, like, to what extent did the well-digging technology like change or
yeah, I think that you could work on a history of well digging technology in Singapore. I'm not sure about that. What
my the primary thing that I'm getting at is more of like the interaction of indigenous knowledge with.
Okay, sure. Like perhaps knowing to dig below the Pohong Kayu Kalat, for example.
Yeah.
Sure, that may have been a factor in knowing where to dig. And, within the tale, of course, it's Farquhar and Raffles or Farquhar, who's like, no, dig it right there. So it's giving him the initiative there. And here, we'll go back to the tale. But as for actual well digging technology beyond a spade or shovel, I don't know how that would work. The thing is, that is it's a fine question. I am incapable of answering that.
The quality in Singapore then actually. I just can't imagine.
Well, you have to remember the Singapore in when all these East India Company ships arrived. Yes, there is already a community of 1,000 people, and that community are primarily pepper and gambir farmers on the areas of what we would today call Dhoby Ghat, maybe kind of bit toward the slopes of Fort Canning Hill. In other words, north of the Padang, or on the other side of the Padang, and there was a community of about 1,000. Now, even up on the rivers, like the Pongo River, or even up there were mostly, who we don't know, but there were most likely small communities up there, both living on the land and on the water. But though, of course, they're not counted. but I'm sure they were there. The thing is, my main point is there was already a settlement here. There was already a community. I mean, if you look at the map from 1819, let's go back one more here. It's very, look, this is 1819, February 1819. And he is saying that there is a village. Wow, now, wait, let me go back. Technology here. Okay. Right there. Look at that. There is a village in Singapore. Okay. There is already a community. They have already set it up. They know where, they're getting their water, things like that. Remember, the Abdullah tale is written after. He wasn't with the landing party. And so part of it is, if you will, his own way of enhancing the tale, if you will. But the thing is, it's a matter of, there was already a village there. They already had to have water supplies. When the East India Company does set up their tents on what would be the area where the Parliament building is today, I mean, I'm sure that, who knows, but it's a good tale. So yeah, you keep going.
Were there any fancy ideas about outsourcing Singapore's water supply to the smaller islands?
The only time I've ever heard it written about on the other islands is when it's like Pulau Senan, pre-1819. So the passing ships would stop here and just say, oh, it's easier just to get it from Pulau Senan or Barnard Island. So you don't really hear of it after that. I mean, until they end up going to Johor in the early 20th century and build the reservoirs there. So.
Professor, thank you for that really interesting talk. I just have a couple of points of information questions. So you had mentioned in the early period, in 1823, the fetch plate system was under the control of 5 individuals. Were they local or were they?
Oh, no, white guys.
So they basically made water a commodity.
Right. But even, okay, this is about supplying the ships. People like Wampo, people like Tan Kim Sing made their fortunes by supplying these ships, providing services to ships. Tan Kim Sing, the richest man in like 1850 Singapore, supplied ships. Wampo, we'll name a neighborhood after him, supplied ships. And so, but right in the early 1820s, if I remember, once again, I have to go back and look at my notes. It was, I believe, British names at least. So yeah, but eventually these services get taken over by these Asian tauques. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to understand that it was the imperial trade that commodified water, like drinking water here.
Yeah. There was, and once again, I don't know it off the top of my head. They did set, I mean, literally in like 1819, 1820, they set the rate and they published it. And it seems that they published that so like you knew it in India. Like if you were sailing from, no one could cheat you, if you will. When you knew what it was going to cost you when you arrived and you went upstream and you said, I want to fill, X number of casks or barrels. There was a set rate for whatever it was. Yeah.
Any more questions?
Well, thank you very much for a very lively talk. I don't know my Singaporean history very well, but I'm trying to situate your point about the mangrove swamp and then Singapore. I thought I remember something about Raffles kind of picking Singapore. He was fleeing from Bencoolen or set fired or something like that, and then he deliberately argued to the East India Company that he wanted to come here.
Sure.
Can you match the timeline?
Okay, there are a number. Well, we have to realize when we talk about Raffles, and you can do this too. There's a number of layers of how it's been understood and interpreted and come to us. Now, the key thing is with Raffles or the East India Company and decisions to come here. Singapore was known through Malay texts. The Fort Canning Hill had graves on it, and when the British first arrived, there were actually buildings, monuments, which they tore down and such. And in other words, there was a remnant of a previous Singapore, which now within our larger history we talk about here is in the 14th century. In the 1300s, Singapore was a trade port, which then shifted through various reasons to where Malacca is. And a lot of history in between, but essentially Singapore within that history is an empty island. And Raffles came in and blessed us, and light shone from him, and he dug a well and water sprung from it, what have you. But there were reasons for Raffles' justification. We also have to remember Raffles was a bit of an outsider. He didn't follow the orders of his superiors. When he went back to England, he was bankrupted. He was sued by the company. Not a lot of people liked him up until the time he died, and then later they constructed a hero out of him. And so when he came here, there were reasons in Malay texts that he knew his Malay, and he knew these texts. There were reasons, a lot of it also was Dutch rivalry, because the Dutch were in Malacca and they had just set up a port in Tanjung Pinang over in the Rio Islands. So he wanted that British site for trade, if you will. His own beliefs in how trade should occur. He did not like the monopoly system the Dutch promoted. He was free trade. And so in many ways, he was a harbinger of the way imperial trade would occur. So that makes him look like, oh, he knew what he was doing. But at the time, he was a bit of a troublemaker and considered in that way. So when he comes, and this gets into, there's so many books you could read on this, and it's ridiculous, but it gets down to this whole Raffles founding Singapore. And one of the issues within national historiography here is he's often portrayed as this kind of lone noble figure stepping ashore. And, then history began, that's year zero. And that of course has come under attack or been questioned, particularly in the last 10 years or so. And so it's become it's problematic is not the right word, because it's not a problem. It's just a touchy issue, and it depends on where people fall on the scale of all this. I get tired of all the talk, because it's just, to me, it's imperialism, and they came, and I don't think we need to glorify the person who came in and started it all. Does that help, or is that making it worse?
Okay, Prof. Actually, we have a couple of questions on Zoom, so I'll just read them out. So the first question goes like this: any idea why Tan Kim Seng donated pipes that were not suitable?
No, he donated money. It's a good question. He donated money, and then the British engineers bought the pipes. And so don't blame Tan Kim Seng for the pipes. Really, you can't. He donated the money with a good heart, if you will. To him, it was probably pocket change, but he donated the money, and then the engineers bought bad pipes. The key point is the Tan Kim Seng donation went for nothing. Maybe that, or didn't actually help in any way, if that makes any sense. And because they used about half of it to buy the pipes, and then the other half was for the work and whatever they needed to get it into town. And then by the time they bought the bad pipes, they also realized they didn't have enough money to bring it into town. It was just a massive snafu. Yeah, a little messed up. So.
Thank you for answering that. The second question is something like this: so does the water infrastructure of Singapore change much in the late colonial period, especially after World War II, as Singapore's population swells again and there is more density and urbanism, especially in the Singapore city area? Okay, well, essentially up till World War II, all they did was replicate the McRitchie Reservoir story. This is all going to be part of a larger book, which is about different things. This is one section of the book. The original book was going to be a history of water up to present, but even I got bored with that after a while, because it was just a repeat. Like they build McRitchie, okay, let's build Upper and Lower Pierce. Let's go to JB.
Let's go to Bedok. It's just the same story over and over again. But by World War II, they had several water supplies, several reservoirs, the most important being the one in Johor, which brought water in to these very cool storage tanks under Fort Canning Hill. But after World War II, the real issue is it's always population. I was showing you these absurdly small numbers of like 30,000 or 90,000 or whatever it was. We have 6 million people here right now. And 6 million people use a lot of water, an amazing amount of water and resources. And so, yes, our water still comes from Johor. It still supplies a vast majority of that. And so these were all set up before World War II. And despite they have initiatives like New Water or the Marina Bay and things, those are nice. But I still want to just say 2 words: 6 million. Supplying water to 6 million people is, to me, just a mind-blowing task of providing such services. But as of now, we still get it from Johor and from, I think they call them the local taps or something like that, the 4 taps. But we still get it from Singapore. As the population grows, much like our food supply and importing food, it's all a matter of taking care of a large, massive urban population. And that's I can be snarky and critique it, but it's also a task it's beyond my comprehension of how you do all that. Sorry.
Sure, thank you. So we have one last question to go, and the question is a continuation one from the previous question that we just read out.
Sure.
So the participants also asked if we still do continue to see a rural-urban divide with regards to the water infrastructure, and if that changes with independence.
With modern Singapore. Well, yes. What's interesting in Singapore is we have to remember, up until the 1950s or even the 1960s, there was an extreme rural-urban divide in Singapore. There was the municipality, which today we would essentially call the CBD. And then there was the rest of Singapore. And about 85–90% of the people lived in what we would call the CBD. And out in the rural areas, they did not have the same types of services. You didn't necessarily have electricity. You didn't necessarily have sewage. You didn't necessarily have running water. You would still use wells. But this was all, in governmental terms, this was considered a different entity in Singapore. There was a rural board who took care of rural issues. And then when we think of the municipality, the municipal council, the government, that's all really in a very small downtown area. Now, there was actually a Ford Foundation grant beginning in the 1930s to try to convert at least the sewage system over. This was done under medical terms, to prevent typhus and cholera and what have you. The idea of having flush toilets, if you will, instead of outhouses. And getting rid of the night soil carriers, but also the delivery of water, the electrification of the rural areas. Now, that all gets kind of mishmashed in with modern Singapore after 65, because we build HDB towns out in those rural areas. And many of us now don't actually live in the CBD. We live out in rural areas that where the modern government brought in this modern infrastructure. So I guess.
Thank you very much for that, Prof. So that brings us to the end of today's session, and we would like to present Dr. Barnard with a token of appreciation for sharing his knowledge and time with us. Could I please request you all to give him a round of applause? Could I please request everyone who's joined in today's session to please get the QR codes at the door when you leave to give us your feedback. It will help us to plan next year's session.